The blood of the ruler of the lower levels spilled across the debris, staining the shattered ground beneath him. After a few moments, the ruler of the lower levels found himself pinned against the rock behind him, unable to move and showing no sign of life. At last, he had been defeated. Jin-Woo stood beside the breathless body of the massive monster, his gaze shifting to the items scattered around, rewards from clearing the level. He remarked that the dropped items were incredible. One by one, he began to collect them, the spoils of his victory. The earring of the demon lord, the sphere of greed, the horn of the volcano, and a fragment of the world tree. The fragment of the world tree drew most of Jin-Woo's attention. He noted that it was a rare ingredient used for crafting magical items of the highest quality, and there was no way he could afford to throw it away. Jin-Woo placed the earring on his ear, its set effect activating as it began to glow with a faint red light. He wondered if by continuing the hunt he would eventually be able to find the remaining items in the set. The last thing that caught Jin-Woo's attention was an item with incredible properties. He realized that if he possessed magic-class skills, he would have been able to use it to its full potential. Jin-Woo clutched the intriguing fire-colored object and stated that it was an orb capable of amplifying magic damage by 50%, a power that made him pause and think more carefully than before. Jin-Woo was suddenly distracted by the sound of clanking. He turned to see the dismembered body parts of the ruler's various subordinates still making faint sounds, twitching with subtle, unsettling movements. Jin-Woo muttered one last tired comment that the night never stopped surprising him more and more with each passing moment. Suddenly, Jin-Woo's gaze was drawn to something even more interesting and far more surprising. The source of that surprise was Iron, who, having gathered all his strength, was walking forward with the severed head of the ruler of the lower levels, gripped in one hand behind him. Jin-Woo no longer seemed surprised by such antics. He looked away, momentarily distracted from his subordinates, and thought about delivering one final blow to the boss. Then turning back, he said aloud to Iron that his shield had just saved him in that moment. Jin-Woo recalled that life-threatening moment with the rampaging ruler of the lower levels. How the monster could have easily crushed him with a single swing of its weapon if it had struck just once. Jin-Woo watched as Iron proudly boasted to the rest of the knights, who could only look on with admiration at such a formidable tank. After a moment, Jin-Woo drew his attention away and finally placed a call back home. Jin-Woo held a fireball in his hand, its intense heat burning his skin like hell. He tried not to show any reaction and quickly passed it into someone else's hands. Jin-Woo stood alongside the mage near a building that looked like it was ready for final destruction. Without a word, he raised his burned fingers and pointed toward the crumbling structure. It didn't take much effort for the subordinate to create something powerful, starting from just a single small fireball. From a small spark, the subordinate formed an enormous fireball, one large enough to sizzle everything in its path. Just a few seconds later, the scale and intensity of it left Jin-Woo even more surprised. Jin-Woo's subordinate directed a powerful strike using the massive fireball, aiming it precisely at the target designated by his Shadow Lord. A moment later, a massive explosion followed, shaking the ground with its force. Jin-Woo looked surprised at the fireball in his hands. It held enough power to be used effectively in battle. His subordinate stretched out his arms once more, clearly offering to do it again. Jin-Woo realized that he hadn't paid any attention to the powerful characteristics of this item. Nowhere did it say that this particular item could only be used by him. Jin-Woo was clearly satisfied with the good news about the new item. He thought about how hunters who relied on magical skills would be able to rip through enemies and unleash devastating attacks with it. Inside a certain building, a peculiar conversation was taking place. One of the unidentified individuals remarked that he hadn't expected anything so interesting upon arriving in Washington, something that had truly surprised him. Hwang Dongsu stood with his arms crossed over his chest, an unhinged smile spreading across his face. He declared that there was some kind of monster, one that could speak a human language. And not just any language, it spoke Korean. The black-haired man firmly denied being called a monster. He asked for a DNA test if they didn't believe him. But the other person responded coldly, saying it made no difference. He was found inside the gate. Hwang Dongsu only smiled wider, his grin turning more twisted as he crushed the black-haired prisoner beneath the weight of his aura. He suggested that monsters might now have the ability to impersonate ordinary humans. The black-haired prisoner slowly lifted his gaze from beneath his long hair. He remained silent for a while, seemingly realizing that no one intended to listen to him, no one even wanted to. Especially not the man who had recently arrived in Washington. Hwang Dongsu's demeanor shifted to one of insistence and seriousness. He made it clear that despite everything, the black-haired man was the best person to cooperate with. And only after receiving someone else's consent would Hwang decide who this prisoner truly was, a human being or a monster capable of speaking the human language. Hwang had nothing left to say but his agreement. There was nothing else he could do while trapped in such an uncomfortable position, surrounded by people who refused to believe a single word he said. The serious man began to ask his accumulated questions, starting with whether the prisoner in the dungeon had already died. How else could he have survived for 10 years? In response, Hwang stated firmly that he was not undead. H-Wang continued to make assumptions about how someone who had died in the dungeon could return alive and unharmed. But H-Wang stated plainly that such a thing was impossible. The prisoner made an attempt to ask a few questions of his own, trying to understand more about the situation. But the man cut him off with a brief response, making it clear that he was the one asking the questions here. But the prisoner ignored the other man's rudeness and bluntness. He raised his gaze and calmly asked how much the man actually knew about gates and monsters, and the H-Wang fell silent, his thoughts pausing as he considered how to respond. Not far from the panoramic window, away from the ongoing conversation, people were occupied with their own thoughts. An assistant called out to the deputy director, but another quickly snapped back, telling him to stay quiet. The men began to listen intently to the conversation unfolding. From outside the windows, they could hear the dialogue continuing, along with someone's sneering remark questioning whether this particular person was truly well informed. The male prisoner watched with a probing gaze as he began to speak, recounting his knowledge of dungeons, gates, and monsters. But to him, all of that was nothing, because what was truly coming was a real disaster, a war unlike anything they had faced before. H-Wang Dongsu listened to the prisoner's warnings and calmly asked if this was his true goal. The prisoner replied that he only wanted to prevent the coming disaster. When the other man asked for clarification, the prisoner refused to elaborate. The man smirked, glaring at the one who claimed to have come to stop the disaster but couldn't provide any details. To him, working together seemed like the best possible outcome, at least on the surface. The prisoner replied that numbers alone would not be enough to overcome the disaster. Even if the most useless people joined forces, they would only end up as cannon fodder, and the man should already be aware of that. The man who had listened to the prisoner's entire speech showed a subtle shift in his expression. Internally, he replayed the other man's cutting words, remarks that suggested he was merely strong on the surface, which only revealed his deeper weakness. The man glanced at the other's ID and realized his name was H-Wang. He noted that if you took away the long unkempt hair, the man would actually appear quite neat, and he certainly didn't look old enough to match the wear on his face. The man read aloud, remarking that the days of being a hunter were glorious. He went on to say that he had contributed enough to secure another man's inheritance for 3 generations, ensuring that he could live without a single worry. The man shifted the conversation toward the subject of children. His thoughts lingered on his son, the one who had always drawn the attention of high-ranking hunters. Even back then, they had been trying to meet him. The man began speaking about the other man's daughter, recognizing her name. The imprisoned man calmly stated that his daughter was Jin-Woo. Without hesitation, the man shifted focus and brought up the topic of his son. The prisoner spoke without pause or hesitation, stating that his son was Sung Jin-Woo, the high-ranking hunter the interrogator had been so fixated on. At that, the interrogator slowly began to smile. The male prisoner began to sense that something was off about the man standing in front of him. No adequate person would smile so wildly. He calmly stated that something was clearly wrong. After a few seconds, the prisoner did not keep him waiting for a reaction. He instantly flared up with a fierce rage, sensing a threat to his children in the man before him. His voice sharpened as he demanded an answer. A frightening aura began to emanate from the imprisoned man, gradually intensifying as if he were ready to incinerate everything in his path. But the furious reaction from the other man came just as quickly, erupting without delay. The imprisoned man considered the possibility that perhaps even the gods had personally granted him another chance. Meanwhile, the angry man pressed his finger against the red button and declared without hesitation that he had no doubt. That monster was real. The man who had arrived in Washington glared angrily at the deputy director, speaking hastily as he insisted that the creature was a monster and appeared hostile. That evacuation was necessary. But the deputy director responded vaguely, telling him to take his time. But the man stated that he had just returned from South Korea and knew exactly what was wrong with the prisoner's son. His aura alone was enough to silence everyone in the vicinity. After a brief pause, he spoke loudly and clearly, announcing that the prisoner's son was dead. The words hit with brutal force, causing H-Wang to freeze in place, his mind reeling in shock. The man wore a crazed smile, his eyes burning with rage and hatred toward H-Wang. With unwavering confidence, he declared that the prisoner would soon be joining his son. A gloomy atmosphere hung heavily in the air. The place resembled a graveyard, but it was clear that many different and even more dangerous monsters lurked within. Suddenly there was a flash. Someone reacted instantly to the flash, jerking his finger toward the source of the bright light that had appeared, urging the others to follow the direction of his pointed hand. The subordinates of one of the monsters reacted instantly to the stranger's movement. They opened their grotesque mouths, unleashing unpleasant screeching sounds that echoed through the area. The monsters on this harder level were numerous and came in all forms. Some still had arrows embedded in their bodies, evidence of previous encounters with other hunters who had come before. From deep within the dungeon, the horrible place suddenly grew brighter than it had been before. The monsters, one by one, began to rise on their bony legs, slowly and stiffly, making their way toward the source of the light. From within the dungeon, the dreadful place suddenly grew brighter than before. The monsters one by one began rising on their bony legs, dragging themselves forward as they barely moved toward the light. Seated on his throne, the boss of yet another grueling floor extended his long finger pointing toward the direction his entire army of barely walking skeletons was now heading. Jin-Woo stepped onto the floor and took in the scene unfolding before him. He already knew he would have to deal with a new boss. Without delay, he turned to Iron and Igris, ready to give his next command. Jin-Woo's gaze shifted instantly, his pupils beginning to glow with a fierce blue light. His silhouette darkened, becoming barely visible, almost ghost-like, as if he himself were one of the summoned subordinates. It didn't take long for the majestic Igris and Iron to respond. At their Shadow Lord's command, they moved with immediate precision, carrying out his order with a speed that any warrior would envy. The number of Jin-Woo's subordinates continued to grow with each boss he defeated. With every victory, his shadow army expanded, each addition standing alongside the likes of Igris and the others, strengthening his forces even further. The Iron Knights and Mages were the first to charge into the serious battle, leading the assault with unwavering determination. It was the majestic Igris who, with precise body movements and refined technique, could easily handle several enemies at once. He never turned his head or broke focus from his task, delivering powerful blows even to those approaching from behind or at his sides. Jin-Woo watched the reaction of the dungeon floor's boss and couldn't help but let out a quiet snicker. The thought crossed his mind: this monster must be stunned by the overwhelming strength of his subordinates. The boss of the floor in question remained seated on his throne, showing no intention of moving. He sat motionless, as if watching the battle unfold beneath him with cold detachment. By the time Jin-Woo stood towering over the monster, he held himself tall and steady, his presence alone casting a shadow over the unmoving boss. Jin-Woo looked at the target in front of him with captivating eyes, now standing very close. In one hand, he held a dagger pulsing with power. He spoke calmly, admitting that he hadn't expected things to unfold quite like this. The boss sitting on his throne slowly opened his jaw, his red eyes fixed on Jin-Woo. There was a flicker of fear in his gaze, and his body remained motionless, as if paralyzed by the overwhelming pressure before him. Jin-Woo gazed more closely at the enemy below him, slightly amused by the creature's reaction. He briefly wondered whether the undead could truly feel fear, but it didn't matter. After a few moments, he turned his focus back, determined not to waste precious time or the energy of his subordinates still engaged in battle. Jin-Woo ended the fight in an instant, massacring his foe with brutal precision. Tearing the creature's face apart at the exact same second, his blade struck the boss of the floor, collapsed into a scattered heap of his own bones, having offered no defense to protect himself in the final moment.